Tonight, we drift back to time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay, and we find ourselves standing not on a dusty plain, but in the midst of a bustling, humid, and astonishingly loud city, a place where the very air seems thick with the smell of baking bread, fermenting beer, wet clay, and roasting mutton, a sensory overload that reminds you instantly that you are a visitor here, and you probably won't survive this. Not because of any particular danger, but because the sheer bacterial novelty of the place would likely overwhelm your modern immune system in a matter of days. A thought to hold lightly as we approach the central feature of this urban landscape, the ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid of sun-baked brick that isn't a tomb like in Egypt but a living, vibrating bridge between the world of humans and the realm of the gods. A cosmic apartment building where each level represents a different stage of celestial ascent, painted in vibrant colors with the lowest level black for the underworld, then red for the earthly world, then blue for the heavenly sky, and finally white or gold for the sun at the very top where the small temple of the patron god rests, a place where only the highest priests and priestesses can go, and the entire structure hums with activity as laborers haul baskets of bitumen for waterproofing. Scribes tally bricks delivered, and priests in elaborate woolen robes chant hymns that echo off the baked surfaces, their voices a low drone that mixes with the distant cries of marketplace vendors, creating a kind of ancient ambient noise track. This is the heart of Sumerian spiritual and philosophical life, a testament to their core belief that the universe was a structured, orderly place, a cosmos born from chaos through divine word and action, and that humanity's role was to serve the gods, to maintain that order through ritual, labor, and the very act of living in organized cities, a concept so fundamental it's etched into every administrative tablet and hymn we've recovered. Now, a mainstream Sumerian historical fact to ground us. The development of cuneiform script, starting around 3400 BCE in the city of Uruk, began not as a way to record poetry or philosophy, but as a brutally practical accounting system for tracking temple economies. How many sheep? How much grain? How many jars of oil? Using pictographs pressed into clay with a reed stylus, which over centuries abstracted into those iconic wedge-shaped marks that could represent not just things but sounds and eventually complex thoughts. A transformation from grocery list to literature. That is one of humanity's greatest intellectual leaps. And here's a quirky, fringe interpretation to ponder as you look up at that ziggurat. Some alternative history enthusiasts, looking at the sheer scale and precision of these structures and the advanced astronomical knowledge encoded in later tablets, propose that the Sumerians were the beneficiaries of knowledge imparted by ancient, non-human intelligences, visitors from elsewhere who gave them the blueprint for civilization. A theory that mainstream archaeology dismisses with the force of 1,000 scholarly sighs, but one that persists in the popular imagination. Probably because it's more fun to imagine alien architects than to credit the slow, grinding, collaborative genius of thousands of humans over generations, a process far less cinematic but infinitely more real. Speaking of scholarly debates, there's a lively one simmering around the nature of the Sumerian city-states themselves. Were they primarily temple states, with all land and production controlled by the priestly class in the name of the gods, or were there significant private enterprises and familial land ownership from the very beginning? The evidence is fragmented and debated, with some tablets showing temple distributions of rations and others recording private sales of fields and dates, leading to a robust academic tussle over just how theocratic early Sumer really was, a debate that involves a lot of meticulous seal impression analysis and passionately delivered conference papers. But let's not get lost in the archives just yet. Feel the sun on your neck. Hear the rhythmic thump of mortar and pestle from a nearby brewer grinding barley, and notice the careful order of everything, from the irrigation canals cutting through the landscape to the standardized weights in the marketplace, all reflecting a deep-seated philosophical need to impose and recognize pattern in a world that could so easily slip back into the primeval waters of chaos. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and only if you're not currently a Babylonian spy trying to steal our superior scribal techniques, because we're onto you, and our clay is laced with a harmless but embarrassing dye that stains your fingers purple for weeks. As we prepare to delve deeper into the minds of these ancient thinkers, I invite you to share your location and the current time where you are, a simple exercise in connecting our disparate moments across the millennia, because while I'm speaking of a night in ancient you might be listening at dawn in Melbourne or late afternoon in Lisbon, and that confluence of times is, in its own way, a very Mesopotamian concept, as they saw time as cyclical, seasonal, and divine, not a linear arrow. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, imagining the cool of the evening finally descending on that Sumerian city, the stars of the Pleiades cluster beginning to glitter above the ziggurat, stars the priests knew as the star cluster, and associated with the god Enlil's breath. And as the administrative gates close, and the tablet houses seal their clay bins for the night, a different kind of thinking begins. A philosophical wondering that moves beyond how many goats, to why are we here, and what is the nature of the divine. It's a good thing they invented writing, because otherwise we'd have no idea they pondered these things, and we just assume they only thought about goats, which, to be fair, was a significant percentage of their cognitive load, but not the entirety, proving that even in the cradle of civilization, the mind could wander from its ledgers. The humor in their literature, often overlooked, is dry and sharp, like in the debate poems where summer and winter bicker like a cosmic married couple, or in the Proverbs where a young wife is advised not to laugh with a stranger unless she wants gossip to fly, showing that the eye roll is at least 5,000 years old. Imagine the first scribe who accidentally dropped a tablet and exclaimed a word that would later be found on a school tablet list of vulgar phrases, his frustration echoing in cuneiform for eternity, a timeless human moment. Their gods were deeply flawed, petulant, and prone to poor decisions, like throwing a cosmic tantrum and causing the flood, which makes Greek mythology look like a polite tea party in comparison. If you think your family reunions are awkward, try being part of the Sumerian pantheon, where your grandfather might try to eat you, and your sister might also be your wife, and everyone is constantly scheming for more power. The concept of me, the divine decrees that established all aspects of civilization from kingship to basket weaving, is like a heavenly constitution, but one where the articles include the art of making leather, and the condition of being confused, which seems like they just threw in everything they could think of at the last divine legislative session. The goddess Inanna's descent to the underworld is the original epic girls' trip that goes terribly wrong, involving a striptease at each of the 7 gates and a corpse hanging on a hook, a cautionary tale about reading the fine print before visiting your sinister sister. The god Enki, god of wisdom and water, is the classic clever trickster who gets drunk and gives away all the me to Inanna, a divine, hold my beer moment that literally reshapes the world. Their afterlife, the gloomy Kur, was so universally bleak that it made no distinction between the good and the bad, which really took the pressure off ethical behavior, but must have been a marketing nightmare for priests trying to encourage piety. The invention of the wheel was monumental, but the first test drive was likely someone frantically running after a rolling potter's wheel, shouting cuneiform curses that we'd need a specialist to translate. The Epic of Gilgamesh is fundamentally about a toxic bromance, a quest for immortality, and the heartbreaking realization that even kings die, wrapped up in beautiful poetry about cedar forests and boat building. The Proverbs are wonderfully pragmatic. A loving heart builds a house, a hatting heart destroys it, which is profound, followed immediately by you can have a king, you can have a lord, but the man to fear is the tax collector, which is just painfully real. The sheer bureaucracy of it all is mind-boggling. They had tablets recording tablets, seals for sealing the seals, and administrators to administer the administrators. A system so complex it probably required a god to invent it. And indeed, they credited one with doing just that. The school tablets from the Edubba, or tablet house, show students being caned for poor penmanship and talking in class, a tradition that has, sadly, not entirely vanished from the earth. The love songs are surprisingly passionate and earthy, with Inanna and Dumuzi's courtship described in wonderfully metaphorical agricultural terms that leave little to the imagination about fertility. The lamentation over the destruction of cities reads like the most devastating poetry, a reminder that the pain of seeing your home reduced to rubble is as ancient as cities themselves. The mathematical tablets doing complex calculations for dividing fields are a thing of beauty, a geometry of survival and taxation. The omens, where they read the future in sheep livers, is the ultimate example of finding patterns where you desperately need them, a practice later refined into a full-blown science of divination. The fact that they had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and a hymn that doubles as a beer recipe is perhaps their most relatable and enduring philosophical contribution to humanity. The Curse of Agade, a text describing the fall of the Akkadian Empire, pins the blame on a king's sacrilege in sacking Enlil's temple, a moral lesson about divine retribution that would echo for centuries. The constant city-state wars were like rival football franchises, but with more chariots and the occasional divine intervention claimed on both sides. The very first author we know by name is a woman, Enheduanna, high priestess of who wrote stunning hymns to Inanna and signed them, a powerful voice from 2300 BCE. The Standard of that beautiful inlaid box, shows the Sumerian ideal of order on one side, peace, with people bringing goods, and chaos on the other, war, with chariots running over enemies, a perfect visual metaphor for their cosmic worldview. And as the night in our imagined city deepens, and the stars wheel overhead, identified and named by those early astronomer priests, we can almost hear the soft, rhythmic chanting from the temple precinct, a sound meant to soothe the gods and keep the universe ticking over, a hum that is both a prayer and a philosophical statement. We are here, we are part of the structure, and we are, for this brief moment between two eternities of chaos, maintaining the delicate balance of it all. Now let that hum blend with the sound of your fan, and let the image of that painted ziggurat under the starry sky fill your mind's eye as we begin to drift deeper into the timeless era, where the boundaries between myth and history, between accounting and philosophy, between a sheep liver and a map of the cosmos, were not boundaries at all, but different facets of the same great and puzzling reality. The air in the tablet house, the Edubba, is still and chalky with the dust of dried clay, a peculiar scent that is the smell of knowledge itself in this world. And here, under the careful watch of the school father, the scribal students, or sons of the tablet house, bend over their lumps of damp earth, their reed styli poised to practice the complex signs for wood, plow, and heaven, their minds aching from the sheer volume of memorization, for to become a scribe is to learn thousands of signs. Their multiple pronunciations and meanings, the intricate grammar of the Sumerian language, a task so daunting it makes modern graduate school look like a pleasant hobby, and these students, some willing, many coerced by ambitious families, are the beating heart of the civilization, the administrators who will run the temple estates, the diplomats who will treat with foreign lands, the poets who will hymn the gods, and in their tedious exercises lies the birth of abstract thought, because the act of writing, of reducing the world to a system of marks, forces a distance, an analysis, a categorization that is the very seed of philosophy. We move from the tangible ziggurat to the intangible world of the mind being forged in these rooms, where lists are not just inventories but attempts to comprehend the universe by nomming its parts, from lists of gods to lists of stones, trees, professions, and even types of oxen, a taxonomic frenzy that reveals a fundamental drive to order and understand creation, a project that is both deeply practical and profoundly metaphysical. A mainstream historical fact to anchor us. The Sumerians are credited with developing the sexagesimal number system, based on the number 60, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle, a system that likely arose from the convenient divisibility of 60 and from their advanced astronomical observations. And this mathematical framework underpinned not just commerce and land division, but their sophisticated models of celestial motion, allowing them to predict lunar phases and planetary movements with remarkable accuracy, creating a calendar that synchronized agricultural life with the heavens. And now for a quirky, fringe interpretation that floats around the edges of this. Some numerology and sacred geometry enthusiasts look at the precise dimensions of ziggurats and the recurrence of certain numbers in temple architecture, and propose that the Sumerians encoded a secret, universal mathematical constant within their buildings, a precursor to the golden ratio, or a hidden code pointing to advanced physics, a theory that, while enchanting, tends to ignore the very practical realities of mud brick construction, and the fact that when your primary building material is sun-dried mud, your architectural precision has a certain forgiving margin of error, a fact any ancient foreman would attest to after his third beer. The scholarly debate that rages in this realm is fascinating. To what extent did the Sumerians conceive of abstract numbers as entities separate from the things they counted? Did they have a pure concept of three, or was it always 3 sheep, 3 days, 3 gods? The evidence from their mathematical tablets suggests a move toward abstraction, with place-value notation in their sexagesimal system, but the debate continues over how philosophical this mathematics truly was, a debate carried out in dense journal articles that would put even a dedicated scribal student to sleep, though they might appreciate the cuneiform-like precision of the footnotes. Let's picture the school father now, a figure of both reverence and terror packing between the rows, his own stylus, a larger, more imposing one, tapping against his palm as he recites a complex grammatical rule for the umpteenth time, his voice a monotone drone that is, ironically, the vehicle for transmitting the most sophisticated knowledge system on the planet at that time. And one student, his hand cramping, makes a mistake, a simple wedge pressed at the wrong angle, and he feels the sharp sting of the reed cane on his shoulder, a pedagogical method that has yet to go out of style in some places, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge has always been intertwined with a certain amount of pain and fear, a reality as old as education itself. But it's not all fear and lists. Within this rigid system, flashes of individuality and even rebellion appear, like the school text where a student complains about his terrible handwriting, or where a dialogue depicts a boy begging his father not to send him back to school, or the hilarious and poignant School Days essay where a student details a day of being caned for every minor infraction, from talking to standing up to having poor signed forms, only to be invited to the house of the school father for dinner at the end, where the father praises the student's supposed diligence, a scene of psychological complexity that feels utterly modern. The philosophy emerging here is one of order through categorization, knowledge through list-making, and wisdom through the mastery of a system, a far cry from the later Greek ideal of dialogic questioning, but no less powerful in its ability to structure reality. Imagine the moment a bright student, perhaps after years of copying lists of legal phrases and god names, suddenly grasps the underlying principle of the syllabic sign, that a drawing of a mouth, ka, could be used not just for mouth, but for the sound ka in any word, a leap of abstraction that is the intellectual equivalent of discovering fire, a mental tool that unlocks all future expression. Their concept of time, deeply cyclical and tied to agricultural and ritual cycles, meant that history was not a straight line of progress, but a series of repeating patterns, of golden ages and declines dictated by divine favor, a comforting, if fatalistic, view that absolves one of the pressure to innovate for innovation's sake. Because if the gods have decreed the rhythms of rise and fall, who are you to try and break the cycle? The humor in the Adaba was likely dark and weary, the kind of jokes exchanged between exhausted apprentices about the school father's bald head or the improbable size of the temple accountant's beer ration, jokes lost to time but whose spirit is preserved in those proverb collections. A donkey which is used for a cultic journey is never happy, a perfect, ancient piece of workplace grumbling. The very first written contracts were for things like fields and slaves, but you have to wonder if the first breach of contract case involved someone selling a donkey that turned out to be more stubborn than the average, which, for a donkey, is really saying something. The love incantations are a blend of poetry and pharmacology, involving sweet words and potentially sweet-smelling herbs, aiming to bind the beloved's heart, a practice that walks the line between romantic and vaguely creepy, depending on your perspective. The god Enki's realm, the Abzu, was the freshwater ocean under the earth, and he was the patron of all the clever arts, making him the patron deity of engineers, magicians, and bureaucrats, a combination that makes perfect sense when you consider that building a canal, drafting a tax code, and casting a spell all require meticulous attention to detail and a firm belief in systems. The Mesopotamian map of the world tablet shows Babylon at the center of a circular earth surrounded by a bitter river, with distant regions labeled where the sun is not seen, which is both geographically limited and a profound metaphor for the known universe. The constant fear of demons like the Gallo, who could drag you off to the underworld for no good reason, must have been a low-grade anxiety humming in the background of daily life, like worrying about traffic, but with more existential dread. The medical texts mix practical observations, like using honey as an antiseptic, with incantations to drive out the demon causing the illness, a holistic approach that treated the physical and spiritual as one, which is coming back into fashion today, albeit with different terminology. The Dialogue of Pessimism is a stunningly cynical text where a master and servant discuss various courses of action in life, from love to charity to rebellion, and for every proposal the servant gives a perfect reason to do it, and when the master changes his mind, the servant gives a perfect reason not to, ending with the master threatening to kill them both, and the servant quipping that the master wouldn't even know how to survive in the afterlife without him. A piece of existential comedy that could be staged tomorrow. The proverbs are endlessly wise and witty. We are doomed to die, let us spend, versus we are doomed to die, let us hoard, capturing the eternal human dilemma in two short lines. The elaborate New Year's festival, the Akitu, involved the king being ritually slapped and humiliated to renew his mandate, a tradition many modern citizens might wish to see revived, if only for the catharsis. The attention to omens meant that nothing was truly accidental. A sneeze, a dog's behavior, the shape of a cloud, all were signs to be interpreted, making the world a constant, nerve-wracking text to be read, a practice that would eventually evolve into the extensive omen series of later Babylonians. The Lament for composed after the city's destruction, personifies the city as a weeping, abandoned woman, a powerful literary device that turns historical trauma into profound poetry. The economic tablets show a level of complexity with loans, interest, and partnerships that underpin their commerce, proving that the soul-crushing mechanics of finance are also an ancient invention. The image of the goddess Inanna storing the divine Me in her boat after getting Enki drunk is one of history's great heist narratives, with the prize being the very foundations of civilization. The school texts include copying famous literary works, so a student's clumsy attempt at a line from Gilgamesh might sit next to a master's elegant version, a snapshot of education in progress. The concept of Nam-Lugal, kingship, was seen as a divine institution lowered from heaven, a handy piece of ideological justification for any ruler wanting to keep the populace in line. The Instructions of Shurapak, a wisdom text from a father to his son, advises against buying a donkey that brays too much or marrying a woman who talks too much, practical advice that has likely been ignored with equal frequency throughout history. The very act of sealing a tablet with a cylinder seal, rolling a miniature story across the clay, was a form of identity and authentication, a signature and a work of art in one. And as the imagined day in the Aduba ends, the students wipe their styli and perhaps sneak off to a tavern for a jar of the good stuff, paid for with a copid prayer sold to a superstitious merchant, their minds full of signs and their shoulders sore from canning. But they are the carriers of the flame, the ones who will inscribe the laws, the treaties, the hymns, and the questions that will outlast the mud-brick walls of their city. Their philosophical contribution is the architecture of thought itself, the grid of language and number laid over the chaos of experience. And as you listen, you can almost feel the weight of that clay tablet in your own hand, the cool smoothness, the resistance as the stylus presses in, forming a wedge that is both a record and a thought made permanent, a tiny, enduring victory against the relentless flow of time and forgetting. The focus shifts now from the disciplined scriptorium to the more ambiguous, shadowy realm of the divine and the cosmic, where the orderly lists of the scribes meet the chaotic, emotional, and often baffling narratives of the gods, because Sumerian philosophy wasn't confined to neat tablets of law or account. It pulsed most vividly in their mythic poetry, in stories that asked fundamental questions about creation, death, love, power, and the capricious nature of existence. And we find ourselves in the courtyard of a wealthy merchant's house during a festival, where a professional reciter, Anar, stands holding a cup of beer, his voice rising and falling in the flickering torchlight as he narrates the epic tale of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and his wild companion Enkidu, a story that is, at its heart, a philosophical exploration of mortality, friendship, and the limits of human ambition. The air is festive, scented with roasting meat and incense, but the story he tells is dark and profound, gripping the listeners not with action alone but with the weight of its themes, the inevitability of loss, the futility of the quest for eternal life, and the bittersweet consolation of legacy, of building the mighty walls of Uruk that will endure as a name, if not a life. And in this communal listening, philosophy is not an academic exercise but a shared emotional and intellectual experience, a way of making sense of the human condition through narrative. A mainstream historical fact to hold onto here. The Standard of that magnificent wooden box inlaid with lapis lazuli and shell discovered in the royal cemetery, depicts on one side war, with chariots and soldiers, and on the other peace, with a banquet scene and people bringing tribute. And this object, likely a sound box for a musical instrument, is a powerful artistic expression of the two fundamental states of Sumerian society, conflict and order, chaos and harmony, and reflects the pervasive duality in their worldview. A duality they saw played out in the stories of their gods and the fates of their cities. Now, a quirky fringe interpretation related to this epic literature. Some have looked at the detailed description of the faraway, where Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, and the mysterious stone ones who help him, and speculated that this is a distorted memory of an advanced, pre-flood civilization, perhaps even a global one, that possessed technology or knowledge lost to the later Sumerians, a sort of antediluvian Atlantis narrative woven into their greatest epic, a theory that, while lacking any archaeological evidence, adds a layer of science fiction wonder to the already powerful text, and is a testament to the story's enduring ability to spark the imagination across millennia. The scholarly debate that engages the minds of specialists listening to this same story today revolves around its unity and purpose. Is the Epic of Gilgamesh a cohesive literary work with a single authorial intent, or is it a composite of earlier, independent Sumerian tales stitched together by later Babylonian editors? The different versions and fragments from various cities and periods fuel this debate, with some seeing a profound thematic unity in the Babylonian Standard Version, and others emphasizing the seams and contradictions that point to its patchwork heritage, a debate that mirrors the very nature of the epic itself, a story about integration and wholeness, built from disparate parts. Listen to the Nar's voice as he describes Enkidu's death, the devastating grief of Gilgamesh, a king who thought himself semi-divine, brought low by the most human of emotions, weeping and clutching his friend's lifeless body, refusing to believe it until a worm falls from the corpse's nose. A moment of such raw, visceral horror and acceptance that it silences the courtyard. The philosophical lesson delivered not as a maxim but as a gut punch. Even the mightiest are dust, and friendship is both our greatest joy and our source of deepest sorrow. This is where Sumerian thought grapples with the big, uncomfortable questions, and their answers are not tidy. The universe was created from a primeval sea, Namu, through a series of divine generations and conflicts, a theogony that is messy, violent, and filled with familial strife, suggesting that order itself is born from struggle, a concept that would have resonated in their politically fractured landscape of competing city-states. Their gods were not omnipotent or omnibenevolent. They were powerful, emotional, needy, and often short-sighted, requiring constant service and pacification, which makes the human role less one of worshipful adoration and more one of anxious maintenance, like being the staff in a mansion full of volatile, immortal celebrities whose moods determine the fate of the world. The myth of Enlil and Ninlil involves trickery, banishment, and a series of unconventional conceptions in the underworld, a story that explains the origins of certain deities, but also reads like a divine soap opera, complete with questionable consent, a reminder that their myths were ideological, meant to explain how things came to be, but also embrace the complexities and moral ambiguities of life. The Descent of Inanna is a masterclass in narrative philosophy. The goddess of love, fertility, and war decides to visit the underworld, the domain of her gloomy sister Ereshkigal, and at each of the 7 gates she is stripped of a piece of her regalia, her power, her identity, until she arrives naked and bowed, only to be killed and hung on a hook, a powerful metaphor for the stripping away of the self in the face of death. And her eventual resurrection, negotiated by Enki's cunning, comes with a price. She must provide a substitute, which becomes her lover Dumuzi, who must spend half the year in the underworld, an explanation for the seasonal cycle, but also a story about sacrifice, the balance of power, and the inescapable cost of even divine ambition. The humor here, when it appears, is dark and ironic, like the gods scrambling like frightened ants during the flood, crowding around the sacrifice offered by Utnapishtim after the waters recede because they're desperately hungry, having received no offerings while humanity was drowned, a moment that undercuts their divine majesty with a very human neediness. Imagine the first audience hearing about Ishtar's marriage proposal to Gilgamesh and his epic rejection, listing all her former lovers whom she turned into animals or otherwise ruined, a scene that is both a brutal takedown of the goddess and a hilarious, if dangerous, piece of divine roasting. The flood story itself, older than the biblical version, presents the gods' decision to wipe out humanity as almost casual, a solution to overpopulation and noise, with Enlil playing the role of the irritable neighbor who decides to solve his problem with divine genocide, only for the softer-hearted Enki to subvert the plan by warning the righteous Utnapishtim, a classic bureaucratic subplot within an apocalypse. The proverbs from this era still bite. A poor man is better dead than alive. If he has bread, he has no salt. If he has salt, he has no bread. A stark observation on poverty that resonates terribly today. The concept of divine wrath was a constant threat, but it was often triggered by seemingly minor ritual oversights, making life a minefield of potential offense, a state of anxiety that probably gave rise to a whole industry of diviners and exorcists, the ancient equivalent of therapists and insurance salesmen combined. The image of Gilgamesh, after failing the test of staying awake for a week, having Utnapishtim's boatman Urshanabi break all the sacred stone objects that helped him cross the waters of death, is a beautiful symbol of the irreversible nature of some journeys and the destruction of the tools of a quest that has ultimately failed. The laments for destroyed cities, like the lament for Ur, give voice to the stones and temples themselves, personifying the city as a grieving mother or a slaughtered bull, a profound expression of collective trauma and the deep connection between people and place. The debate poems, like Debate Between Summer and Winter, present natural forces as personified deities arguing their merits before a father god, who ultimately declares both necessary, a literary form that explores duality and balance through competitive dialogue, a precursor to philosophical dialectics. The love songs of Dumuzi and Inanna, with their erotic agricultural metaphors, my garden moistened, my field of apples, blend the sacred and the sensual, the fertility of the land and the fertility of the body, in a way that is celebratory and deeply interconnected. The constant political reality of city-states vying for supremacy under the nominal kingship, that moved from one city to another according to divine, will provided a real-world backdrop for the stories of shifting divine favor and cosmic battles. The very idea that the gods created humans to do their work for them, to farm, to build temples, to offer food, is a foundational myth that justifies both the social hierarchy and the relentless toil of existence, a philosophical bedrock that is pragmatic rather than comforting. The figure of the Atalu, the lazy or incompetent person, appears in proverbs and school texts as a cautionary figure, the opposite of the ideal industrious citizen, showing that the work ethic was divinely mandated from the start. And as the Nar's story winds down, with Gilgamesh returned to Uruk, weary but wiser, pointing to the mighty walls he built, the listeners in the courtyard exhale, take a drink, and perhaps feel a strange kinship with this ancient, flawed hero. Because his quest for meaning in the face of death is their quest, is our quest, and the answer he receives, that immortality lies in what you build, in the enduring works of your hands and the memory of your name, is a profoundly humanistic philosophy emerging from a theocentric world, a whisper of legacy against the vast, silent dark. Let that whisper sit with you now, as the torchlight in your mind's eye gilds the faces of the listening crowd, and the stars above Uruk, the same stars we see tonight, bear silent witness to a story that will outlast its walls, its language, and even its gods. The narrative flow now takes us from the communal storytelling into the private, anxious spaces of the individual mind, because, for all their grand cosmic schemes and city-building projects, the Sumerians and their Akkadian successors were deeply concerned with personal fate, with luck, with the inscrutable will of the gods as it applied to one's health, wealth, and daily survival. And we find ourselves in the dim, smoky chamber of a Baru priest, a diviner, a man trained to read the messages of the gods in the entrails of a sacrificed sheep, specifically its liver, a practice known as hepatoscopy, which sounds like a medical specialty, but was in fact the cutting-edge science of forecasting, a philosophical attempt to discern pattern and intention in what appears to be random, to find guidance in the very viscera of life. The room is quiet, tense. A wealthy merchant, worried about a risky trading venture to the distant north, has provided a flawless lamb, and now, as the animal's blood drains into a basin and the distinctive metallic scent fills the air, the diviner, his hand steady and stained, carefully removes the liver, this dark, complex organ believed to be the seat of emotion and intention, and lays it on a reed mat, his eyes scanning its lobes, the gallbladder, the portal vein, the markings and protrusions, comparing them mentally to the elaborate clay models of livers used for training, models inscribed with annotations about what each feature portends for the future, a literal map of destiny written in flesh. This is philosophy applied at the most immediate personal level, the belief that the universe is communicative, that the gods are constantly sending signs, and that the key to navigating life's uncertainties is to learn this divine language, a language of quirks and bumps in a sheep's liver, of the flight patterns of birds, of the shapes of oil dropped into water, of dreams, and even of random events like a sneeze or a dog's bark. A mainstream historical fact to cling to in this gory but fascinating scene. We have actual surviving clay models of sheep livers from Mari and other sites, some with inscriptions detailing the prognostications for various markings, and these represent the world's oldest known formalized system of divination, a system that would be elaborated and refined by the Babylonians and Assyrians into an immense, encyclopedic corpus of omens, covering everything from celestial phenomena to the behavior of household pests, creating a vast, interlocking web of cause and effect that governed decision-making at all levels of society, from the king planning a war to a farmer planting his field. And here's a quirky fringe interpretation that has arisen from this practice. Some modern psychics and proponents of scrying or reading objects see hepatoscopy as a precursor to their own arts, suggesting that the Sumerian diviners were tapping into a universal field of information or intuition through a focused, ritualized gaze upon a complex natural object, and that the liver, as a filter of life, was a particularly potent screen for this information, a theory that, while wholly unscientific, does speak to the human desire to find meaning in complexity. A desire the Sumerians certainly shared, even if their methodology was more visceral. The scholarly debate that occupies academics studying these practices is intense. Were these diviners genuine believers in their own system, or were they cynical manipulators using a pseudoscience to reinforce state power and social control? The evidence suggests a mix. The system was incredibly complex, requiring years of training and meticulous record-keeping, which points to a sincere intellectual investment. But there are also letters between kings and their diviners showing the diviners sometimes delivering politically convenient answers, suggesting a pragmatic flexibility, a debate that essentially asks whether the first scientists were also the first spin doctors, a question with uncomfortable modern parallels. Watch the diviner's face now, a mask of concentration, as he gently prods a small, unusual bump on the caudate lobe, his mind racing through the memorized omen series. If the finger of the liver is long and points to the path of the king, he mutters, and then his eyes widen slightly. The configuration is favorable for long journeys, but there is a slight pallor on the station of the enemy, suggesting minor difficulties but ultimate success. He looks up at the merchant, whose face is a study in controlled fear, and delivers the verdict in a calm, authoritative tone, his voice the conduit for the divine will, and the merchant's shoulders slump in relief, his offering of silver now seeming a wise investment, his philosophical anxiety about an uncertain future temporarily assuaged by the application of a system, any system, that promises a glimpse behind the curtain of fate. This is the underside of the grand cosmic order: personal astrology, haruspicy, oniromancy, dream interpretation, all branches of the same tree of knowledge that sought to mitigate the terrifying randomness of life in a world ruled by moody, unpredictable gods. The humor here is gallows humor, the kind shared between diviners after a long day of reading livers. Well, that one had a gallbladder like a shriveled date. The client's marriage prospects are not good, or the inevitable jokes about clients who clearly only wanted to hear a specific answer and got huffy when the liver suggested otherwise. Imagine the first time a diviner had to explain to a king that the ominous shadow on a lunar eclipse meant he should appoint a substitute king, a poor schmuck who would sit on the throne for the dangerous period and hopefully absorb any evil destined for the real monarch, only to be quietly killed afterwards. A job with terrible benefits but a unique line on the resume. The Ludlow Bel Nemeki, the Babylonian job, is a text from a later period but rooted in the same worldview, where a righteous nobleman is afflicted with every possible misery as his personal god seems to abandon him, and he laments his inability to understand why, Despite all his piety, he suffers. A profound exploration of the problem of divine justice and the limits of human comprehension, a philosophical crisis of faith recorded on a tablet. The household omens are wonderfully mundane. If a mouse digs a hole in a man's house, that man will have grief. Or, if a lizard falls on a man from the roof, the god will give that man a present, making every domestic incident a potential cosmic message. The medical incantations often begin with a story of a god suffering the same ailment and being cured by another god, establishing a mythical precedent for the healing ritual to follow, a blend of narrative and therapy. The constant need for purification rituals, for avoiding taboo foods on certain days, for wearing amulets against the evil eye, created a life governed by ritual precaution, a philosophical approach that saw danger and meaning in every action and object. The Namberbai rituals were performed to undo the portended evil of an omen, a kind of cosmic Control-Alt-Delete, showing a belief that while fate was written, it could sometimes be edited with the right ritual keystrokes. The Proverbs reflect this anxious pragmatism. When you are thirsty, the canal is far away. When you are sated, the canal is near, a comment on subjective perception and desire. The image of a priest carefully examining the coils of smoke from burning cedar resin, looking for shapes that might indicate the god's presence or mood, is a study in concentrated interpretation, a search for the signal in the noise. The dream interpreters had manuals listing common dream symbols and their meanings, turning the chaotic inner cinema of the night into a standardized text to be decoded upon waking. The sheer volume of omen tablets is staggering, representing a colossal investment of intellectual energy into predicting the unpredictable, a monument to human anxiety and our desperate need for a narrative of cause and effect. The dialogue between a man and his god has the man complaining of his suffering and his personal god eventually responding with comfort, not by explaining the cause, but by promising future favor, a therapeutic model based on divine reassurance rather than explanation. The use of substitute figurines in rituals to absorb illness or evil, then being destroyed or buried, is a powerful form of sympathetic magic, a physical philosophy that believes symbols can manipulate reality. The fear of ghosts, of restless spirits who hadn't been given proper burial rites, led to complex funerary practices and monthly offerings of food and water poured through a pipe into the grave. A philosophy of caring for the dead that was as much about protecting the living from their displeasure as about respect. The image of Gilgamesh in his despair, seeking an omen from a dream, and his mother Ninsun interpreting it for him, shows divination integrated into the very fabric of their greatest literature. The exorcist, or Ashipu, was part doctor, part priest, part psychologist, using incantations, rituals, and practical remedies to treat what we might call physical illness, mental distress, or plain bad luck, seeing them all as manifestations of spiritual imbalance. And as the merchant in our scene leaves the diviner's chamber, clutching a small clay model of a favorable liver as a talisman, he steps back into the noisy, sunlit street, his step a little lighter, his philosophical burden momentarily lifted, because for a price and a sheep, he has been given a story about his future, a narrative thread to hold onto in the labyrinth of chance. This is the intimate daily face of Mesopotamian philosophy, not the epic quest for immortality, but the humble, persistent attempt to read the signs, to appease the powers, to navigate the treacherous but patterned waters of a universe that spoke, if only one knew how to listen, in the language of livers, stars, and dreams. Let that image of the examined liver, a universe in miniature, rest in your mind, a strange and potent symbol of the ancient, enduring quest to know what comes next. The journey through the timeless era now ascends from the personal and the visceral back to the monumental and the enduring, but with a twist, because we are entering the realm of law and social order, the philosophy of how humans should live together under the watchful eyes of both the king and the gods, and we find ourselves in the throne room of Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, around 2100 BCE, or perhaps Hammurabi of Babylon centuries later. As a royal scribe presses the final lines of a legal code into a damp clay pillar, a stele that will be erected in a public place for all to see, or more accurately, for the literate few to read aloud to the many, proclaiming the king's commitment to justice, to protecting the weak from the strong, and to establishing truth and right order in the land, a philosophical concept known as Kiddam U Misharum. The air here is different from the diviner's chamber. It's the cool, formal air of state power, scented with cedar oil and polished stone, and the sound is the soft, deliberate tap-tap-tap of the stylus. Each wedge a building block of societal structure, each law an attempt to translate cosmic order into human interaction, to replace the chaos of blood feud and arbitrary power with a standardized, divinely sanctioned system of consequences. A revolutionary idea that places the ruler as the shepherd and guardian of justice. A role borrowed directly from the gods. This is philosophy made concrete, etched in stone for permanence, and while the famous eye for an eye principle literally, if a man destroys the eye of another man of the same rank, they shall destroy his eye, captures the imagination. The codes are far more nuanced, covering everything from false accusations and builder liability for faulty construction that causes death, to the prices for hearing oxen and the rights of divorced women, creating a sprawling, pragmatic document that is as much a treatise on social economics as it is on justice. A mainstream historical fact to anchor this scene. The Code of Hammurabi, though the most famous, was not the first. That honor likely goes to the Code of Ur-Nammu, or perhaps even earlier, less complete examples, and these codes were not comprehensive law books as we understand them, but rather collections of precedent-setting royal decrees and exemplary cases, designed to showcase the king's role as a just ruler and to provide guidance for judges, a monumental exercise in legal philosophy and royal propaganda that influenced the concept of law for millennia to come. Now, a quirky fringe interpretation that swirls around these ancient laws. Some have looked at the precise, almost mathematical nature of the punishments and the sophisticated structure of the codes, and speculated that they reflect a lost, highly logical, and even scientific approach to society, perhaps influenced by an earlier, more advanced culture or even by extraterrestrial concepts of order. A theory that, again, ignores the very human, practical, and often brutal realities of power and retribution that the codes also enshrine, such as the drowning of a wife accused of adultery unless her husband pardons her, or the death of a builder whose poorly constructed house collapses and kills the owner's son, laws that are more about deterrence and social control than abstract logic. The scholarly debate that occupies legal historians is a rich one. To what extent were these codes actually applied in daily courts? The survival of thousands of court records and contracts shows that local judges often decided cases based on local custom, witness testimony, and oaths, referencing the king's justice in broad terms but not necessarily citing specific statutes from the stele, leading to a debate about whether these were aspirational monuments or active legal tools. A debate that parallels modern discussions about the gap between the law on the books and the law in practice. A gap that seems to be as old as law itself. Watch the scribe's hands now, steady and sure as he inscribes the final, glorious curses on the bottom of the stele. May any king who arises in the future, who destroys the law which I have inscribed, may the great gods tear out his foundations, destroy his progeny. A philosophical claim that just law has a cosmic, enduring validity that transcends the mortal king who proclaims it, that it is woven into the very fabric of the divine order, and to violate it is to invite cosmic retribution, a powerful melding of legal, political, and religious thought. The philosophy embedded here is one of proportionality, of social hierarchy, with penalties often varying by the social status of perpetrator and victim, and of the state's role in regulating conflict, a move away from private vengeance toward public justice, however imperfect. The humor, as always, is dark and emerges from the human situations described. A law about a goring ox that has already killed someone, making its owner liable unless he was previously warned about the ox's tendencies, is essentially the world's first recorded case of "I told you so" having legal consequences. Imagine the first contract dispute over a delayed delivery of onions, argued before a judge in the city gate, with each side bringing witnesses and sealed tablets, and the judge finally ordering the delinquent onion seller to pay double, a scene of mundane justice that is the true lifeblood of the system. Apollos concept, where a criminal could claim sanctuary at a temple or even by grasping the horns of the altar, shows a limitation on state power, a sacred space where even justice had to pause, a philosophical tension between divine mercy and human law. The laws regarding slaves are complex, treating them as property but also as human beings with certain rights, like the right to marry a free person, reflecting the ambiguous, uncomfortable place of slavery within their ordered society. The care taken in contracts for adoption, for establishing wet nurses, for setting the terms of apprenticeship, reveals a society deeply concerned with defining relationships and responsibilities legally, with clay as the witness. The Proverbs give a folk philosophy counterpart to the formal laws. Who builds like a lord, lives like a slave. Who builds like a slave, lives like a lord. A cynical take on overextension that no legal code could address. The Misharim, edicts, occasional royal decrees that canceled certain debts and freed debt slaves, were a philosophical and practical pressure valve for society, a recognition that economic imbalances could become so severe they threatened the entire cosmic social order, and needed a periodic divinely ordained reset. The image of the sun god Shamus, god of justice, handing the symbols of authority to Hammurabi on the top of his stele, is the ultimate icon of the divine source of law, a visual philosophy of power. The lawsuits brought by women, recorded in tablets, show them actively using the legal system to defend their dowries and property rights, indicating a space for female agency within a patriarchal structure. The elaborate oath-taking rituals, where a person swore by the life of the king and the gods, turned a legal statement into a spiritual act, with perjury inviting divine, not just human, punishment. The laws about irrigation are particularly telling. If a man's negligence causes his field to flood and damage his neighbor, he must compensate him in grain, a rule born directly from the environmental reality of Mesopotamia, where water was life but also a potential source of conflict. The lex talionis, law of retaliation, was, in its context, a limiting principle. It prevented escalation, saying the punishment must match the crime and not exceed it, a philosophical step toward moderation in justice. The constant references to the king's peace, or the king's justice, in letters and petitions show how this philosophical ideal trickled down into the popular consciousness as a last resort against local corruption or oppression. The use of the river ordeal, where an accused person would be thrown into the river, with survival indicating innocence, is a stark example of transferring judgment directly to the divine, a legal philosophy of ultimate appeal. The wisdom literature, like the Counsels of Wisdom, advises on ethical behavior, truth-telling, and discretion, providing a moral complement to the legal codes, a philosophy of personal virtue alongside public law. And as the scribe finishes, and the massive stele is carefully hauled upright to be placed in the temple courtyard, it stands not just as a list of rules, but as a philosophical manifesto, that human society is governable by reason and principle, that order is preferable to chaos, that justice, however defined, is a divine imperative, and that the legacy of a ruler, and by extension a civilization, is measured by the fairness and stability he bequeaths to his people. This stele, and others like it, are the hardened clay bones of their social philosophy, the skeleton upon which the flesh of daily life was hung. Let the final tap of that stylus echo in your mind, a sound that is the birth of legal thought, the sound of a civilization trying, with all its might and all its flaws, to build a world that would stand as solidly as that inscribed stone. And now we reach the final contemplation, the quiet after the narrative storm, where the ziggurat, the tablet house, the epic, the liver, and the lost stele all coalesce into a single, fatting image under the vast Mesopotamian night sky. A sky now empty of the gods who once animated it, but still glittering with the same constellations they named and watched. And we find ourselves no longer in a specific place, but in the accumulated silence of centuries. Standing metaphorically before a cracked and fragmented tablet, the edges worn smooth by time, the cuneiform signs within sometimes clear, sometimes tantalizingly broken, a physical metaphor for our understanding of this timeless era, an understanding that is always partial, always being pieced together by the gentle hands of archaeologists, philologists, and historians, whose work is itself a kind of philosophical act, reconstructing a worldview from shattered pieces. This is the philosophy of legacy, of memory, of what endures when cities become mounds of pottery shards and mighty kings become names on a damaged king list. And the answer, whispered from the clay, is that ideas endure, that the structures of thought, the list, the law, the epic poem, the mathematical system, outlive the mud brick walls that house them, traveling down millennia to shape our own world in ways we scarcely recognize. The air here is the still air of a museum storage room, or the dry, hot wind blowing over the tell of a breath of eternity that carries no scent but dust. And the sound is the almost imperceptible hum of time itself, a frequency too low for human hearing but felt in the bones, a vibration of deep history. We reflect not on a new fact but on the totality of the journey, from the practical to the spiritual, from the communal to the personal, from the chaotic myth to the ordered code. The ancient Mesopotamian mind sought, above all, meaning. Meaning in the stars, in the organs of a sheep, in the rise and fall of cities, in the inevitability of death, and in the daily grind of accounting and farming. They did not separate these pursuits. The same scribe who tallied barley might copy a hymn to Inanna. The same priest who read omens might advise the king on law, because their philosophy was holistic, seeing the connections between the cosmic, the political, the personal, and the mundane. Their greatest contribution may be this very sense of an interconnected, structured cosmos, a universe that operated on principles that could be learned, catalogued, placated, and sometimes even understood. A universe that was fundamentally textual, a book written in the language of things and events, waiting to be read by the literate, the scribes, the priests, the diviners. They bequeath to us not just the wheel, writing, and the arch, but the very concepts of timekeeping, legal precedents, historical record, and literary narrative. They gave us the archetype of the hero struggling with mortality, the lament for lost cities, the bureaucratic tablet, and the cynical proverb. They looked at the stars and saw not just points of light, but the writing of the gods, and they mapped those stars, creating the first scientific observations that would later fuel astronomy. They looked at a society and dared to inscribe rules, attempting to replace arbitrary power with measured justice. They experienced profound grief and set it to poetry so beautiful it still aches. They felt the anxiety of uncertainty and built a vast system of divination to manage it. They were, in short, utterly human, grappling with the same fundamental questions we do, but with a different set of tools and a different mythological framework. Their answers were not our answers, but their questions were our questions. Why are we here? What is the right way to live? What happens when we die? Why do the innocent suffer? How do we build a society that is just and stable? The timeless era is not a period of static perfection, but a long, slow conversation with these questions, a conversation recorded in clay that baked hard in the sun or was fired in kilns, preserving their voices across the abyss of years. As you listen now, in your own time and place, the distance collapses. The scribe who pressed a sign for eternity 4,000 years ago did so with the same human hand you possess. The parent who told a child a proverb about honesty did so with the same hope for that child's future. The lover who recited a poem to his beloved felt the same dizzying rush of emotion. The farmer who looked at the sky and prayed for rain felt the same dependence on forces beyond his control. This is the true connection, the philosophical thread. Not alien visitors or lost supercivilizations, but the continuous, brave, flawed, brilliant, and endlessly creative project of being human in a mysterious universe. So let the images we've woven tonight, the painted ziggurat, the dusty edubba, the torchlit courtyard, the diviner's chamber, the inscribed stele, soften and blend into a gentle, abstract pattern behind your closed eyes, like the impression of a cylinder seal rolled on clay, a repeating design of human thought and endeavor. Let the sounds fade into a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the rhythm of your own breath. The timeless era does not end. It merely becomes the foundation upon which every subsequent thought is built, the clay from which our own philosophical houses are formed. We leave it now, not as a place to visit, but as a part of our own deep inheritance, a whisper in the genetic and cultural code that says, "We wondered too. We tried too. We built, we wrote, we loved, we grieved, and we sought meaning in the stars and in the earth." And with that acknowledgement, we can rest, having touched for a night the very origins of the questions that make us who we are. The journey is complete. The stars over Mesopotamia set, and the stars over your own home continue their ancient, slow wheel. Let them watch over you now, as you drift into sleep, carrying with you the faint, enduring echo of the first words ever pressed into clay. End of script. Sweet dreams.